In 2015, the current Prime Minister of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, went to Srebrenica to commemorate 20 years of the genocide and massacre that happened, and soon after he's been stoned by the crowd. This attack shows that many of the events that happened during the Bosnian War in the Bosnian region itself has still not been reconciled for. And one of the reasons for why that is the case are the textbooks that are currently in use, as each of the textbooks is found to kind of portray and justify the actions of its own state and be very much ideologically fueled. Therefore, the research that I dedicated 6 months to tackles the narration of the Bosnian War by answering the research question of how does the representation in the Serbian history textbooks of the Bosnian War compare to the representation in textbooks used in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Specifically, this research is important because, firstly, in an academic sense, there is a scarce amount of resources available on this topic. But more importantly, this research has a very practical implementation because it can be used as a starting dialogue about the way that Balkan Wars is generally understood within the Balkans. And in relation to that, even though my primary concern were the textbooks that were used in Serbia, I decided to compare them to the ones used in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia as to see if the Serbian system portrays the one-sided and single perspective. And in answering this question, the research also tries to tackle the reasons for why discrepancies are there, but also offers some recommendations for the improvement of the Serbian educational system. To do so, I used textbooks that are used for the for 8th grade of primary education, because 8th grade is the first time that students encounter Bosnian War in an academic context, but also because in Serbia, the curriculum for the primary school is prescribed by the ministry in itself. And all schools follow the exact same curricula, therefore all 8th graders are exposed to the same information. I used textbooks from for the well-known and established publishers in each of these 3 countries. I used 2 textbooks from Serbia, 2 for Croatia, and given that the system in Bosnia and Herzegovina is divided into 3 parts, for Croatians, Bosnian Muslims, and Serbs, I used 1 textbook for each of these 3 systems. However, it turned out that the textbooks that are used in Croatia and the ones used for the Croatian system in Bosnia and Herzegovina are the same in their content. Therefore, my analysis included 6 textbooks. I focused on 3 specific events, which were the Operation Storm, Vukovar, and events in Srebrenica, because these are very much debated events even now, 25 years after the war has taken place. I also focused on 2 main political figures at the time, which were Slobodan Milošević, the president of Serbia, and Franjo Tuđman, the president of Croatia. And I also paid a close attention to the labeling of events, specifically as those convey the aim of the narration in itself. I used a discursive approach, discursive analysis, and coded the textbooks, and I also conducted 3 interviews with, actually 4 interviews, 3 with Serbian historians and 1 with a Serbian history teacher. And I think one of the biggest problems in the research in itself is the fact that I'm Serbian. Therefore, I really try to be aware of my own bias in the way that it can influence my research. Therefore, I shared my findings and my themes with the experts, meaning the historians, and I also cross-referenced my findings with my Bosnian and Croatian friends and tried to be as neutral as possible to reduce my bias. And ultimately, after the coding analysis, there were 3 themes that emerged. First of the themes were victims versus aggressors, and specifically it relates to the fact that each of the textbooks portrays its own ethnic group as a victim of someone else's aggression. Therefore, this element of victimization is extremely important and found in all the textbooks. For example, Operation Storm. In Serbian history textbooks, it is portrayed as this event that resulted in a huge amount of Serbian refugees that were forced to leave the areas they have traditionally inhabited for centuries. However, in Croatian textbooks, it is said that Serbs have decided to freely leave the country. So these kinds of little wording games are used in all of these textbooks. Particularly important is also the element of past victimization, relating the events to the Second World War and kind of heightening the suffering on one's own ethnic group, and also the framing of victimization, because in most of the textbooks it is found that the actions that were committed by one ethnic group were used to be equalized with the actions that other ethnic groups have committed. The second theme that emerged is the theme on protectors versus the opponents of the regime, relating to the two key leaders, where in textbooks used for Serbs and Bosnian Serbs, Milosevic is portrayed as the leader who tried to protect the communist regime of Yugoslavia and to prevent Yugoslavia from dissolving. However, textbooks for Muslims and Croatians portray Milosevic as a person that tried to prevent the democratization of the region, and at the same time he was responsible for many atrocities that took place. Similar discrepancies are also found in the description of Franjo Tuđman, where Serbian textbooks and textbooks for Bosnian Serbs portray him as an aggressor who tried to bring down the beloved country of Yugoslavia and its communist regime. And also they draw comparisons between the government of Croatia that was aligned with Nazi Germany and kind of trying to evoke this representation of Tuđman as a fascist, while as on the other hand, textbooks for Croatian and Bosnian Muslims represent him as someone who fought for the self-determination and democracy. When asked about these differences, historians claim that this is one of their unreconcilable issues, and for instance, one historian even said that for the current political narrations to sustain, Serbs need Milosevic, Serbs need Tuđman, and Croats need Milosevic. And the third theme that emerged is the theme on ethnic cleansing, specifically relating to the labeling of events, and strong and politically defined labels such as genocides or massacres are found to be attributed to the atrocities committed by the other ethnic groups, while as politically weaker and moderated labels such as wrongdoings are found to be attributed to the atrocities that one's own ethnic group has committed. And particularly important here is Srebrenica, where in Serbian history textbooks, Srebrenica is an instance of ethnic cleansing out of many others that have occurred during the war. For Croatians, it is also an ethnic cleansing, however, not as important to be labeled a genocide. In textbooks used for Bosnian Serbs, there is no mention of Srebrenica at all, while as in textbooks used for Bosnian Muslims, Srebrenica is emphasized as a genocide and has been confirmed by the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. Therefore, all of these convey that there are significant differences in the way how history is understood in the Balkans. But specifically, there are three similarities that are found in each of the textbooks. Specifically, each textbook portrays and justifies the action of one's own ethnic group. Secondly, there is a division on self and the other, and division of these ethnic groups, for instance, Serbs versus Croatians, Bosnians versus Serbs, Muslims versus Catholics or Christians in general. And the third unifying thread is that all textbooks are found to omit certain information about some actors in the war. And there are many implications of such narration, but essentially children will be taught to not use their own critical understanding of what actually happened in the war. They will not be able to understand why certain groups committed and acted the way they did, as well as the state. Therefore, this only furthers the divisions within the region, and these divisive stereotypes keep being perpetuated within the generations to follow. Based on all of this, there are 6 recommendations for the Serbian system specifically to move towards accounts of a more inclusive narration. And the first one would certainly be including perspectives of other ethnic groups, as that is important for the critical understanding of children. Secondly, more primary sources. However, for these primary sources to be effectively taught, teachers should also be trained. Also, the 4th recommendation would be more contextual rather than factual information. The 5th would be that children shall not only be learning about the war from textbooks, but also visiting museums and being exposed to documentaries and other kinds of learning techniques as to understand the complexity of the war. And lastly, but very importantly for the system as a whole, is that history cannot just be taught by a couple of historians that were selected by the publishing groups, but rather it requires joint efforts of pedagogues, political scientists, historians, psychologists, as to understand how the atrocities of this war can actually be portrayed to the young generations.